What's going on, everybody? My name is Kador, and today we are going to be moving out of Deadmau5's discography and into Tim Hecker's. And to celebrate the change, I got a new haircut. This actually had nothing to do with each other, but whatever. This video is going to be a sort of mini discography review, which means that I'm going to be sort of briefly discussing and grading each one of Tim Hecker's albums up to this point, excluding his most recent one, Love Streams, which I will then review in more detail and depth in my next video. I should also note that I've changed my grading system for albums, especially albums like these, where the individual tracks aren't so much the concern, it's more like the whole album, the whole picture kind of thing is kind of what should be paid attention to. So I'm not going to do the whole grade each track separately, average them together, and that's the final grade kind of thing, because that just produced a lot of results that I found are kind of inaccurate for how I actually felt about the album. So instead I'm just going to be giving it a grade based on what I think it should get. No math involved here. The grade will be out of 10, and it will be rounded to the nearest 0.5, the nearest half number out of 10, so it'll either end in 0.5 or just be a whole number. But yeah, with that all out of the way, Tim Hecker, he is a ambient, experimental, abstract soundscape electronic producer. He's very interesting, and basically his style of music, for the most part, is he takes the sort of ambient music foundation, like kind of Brian Eno-esque works, but then he kind of jacks it up a bit and makes the tracks much more intense, noisy, just uses a lot of different sounds that you don't normally get in just music in general, and he uses a bunch of different instrumentation and just a lot of very interesting sounds, both electronic and non-electronic, and just kind of blends it all together into this kind of abstract, slightly randomized feeling, just swath of sound that is often quite beautiful. In his more recent work, he has been experimenting a lot more and just done a lot of crazy, noisy, gritty stuff, as well as some more warm, light stuff with just a bunch of different kinds of instruments used in very creative ways and sort of vocals used in very strange ways. His music is super interesting to listen to. But enough rambling on about Tim Hecker himself, let's just dive right into his discography. So we start things off with Haunt Me, Do It Again, the first release under the Tim Hecker name, and the sort of pioneer album for this type of style of music, this ambient music that's been very messed with and is very glitchy, strange, and experimental. There's a decent amount of experimentation and interesting sounds in this album. There's also some cool uses of sampling here and there to keep things interesting. This album's also pretty light for the most part, sort of what you'd expect out of ambient music, but again with the sort of experimental twist. And the bad parts of this album is just that occasionally some tracks can kind of get drawn out a little bit long, and the experimentation is pretty kind of like in the background for the most part. It is not usually super upfront, and there isn't a huge variety of sounds, but it is definitely there, and you can definitely tell that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Pretty solid album. I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10. Next we have Radio Amor. This album is pretty similar to Haunt Me, but it is more melodic, and there's use of different instruments and sounds, and the use of sort of noises and stuff like that, and sampling is much more present in this one than it was in the other one. It basically follows the same trend, but kind of takes the sampling and the interesting experimentation and noises to a further level. And the main problem with this is just that kind of the same problem that the other album has, but in a little bit of a greater sense. Just a lot of times there is just some ambient drone synth that just goes on for a super long time without too much progression. There's less progression and less, there's more just time that's just kind of like spent with this kind of static, unmoving droning synth rather than anything super interesting happening. And that happens a couple times in this album, but other than those few times, it is pretty interesting and pretty engaging, and there's a lot of cool melodies and sounds in this one, so I'll give it another 7.5 out of 10. Mirages takes a much darker and much noisier approach to Tim Hecker's sound that he's been developing up to this point. A lot of tracks have a lot of influences from like harsh noise that is very abrasive but not overly so, and it still usually weaves, the noise usually weaves its way into the more ambient synth work pretty well, and there's just a lot of noise coupled with the very soft synths and the very dark, muffled, bassy kind of melodic aspects of this album. Mirages is more sonically interesting than his previous albums. There's a lot more going on in terms of the sound of it, but it is a bit less melodic. A lot of the melodies are either very simple or just kind of obscured by all the noise that's going on. But the album is more intense and more sort of unique, more of an original thing than the past two albums as well. So I'd say it's a slight step up. I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Next is Harmony in Ultraviolet. This one's sort of similar to Radio Amor, but with more melody, but less kind of interesting sounds, more sort of like muffled noise, not the super abrasive stuff that's on Mirages, but more just kind of muffled textural noise, I guess, that just sort of like fits in with the synth work, but it's not really focused on like it was in Mirages. This album doesn't really do anything too new in terms of experimentation or sounds that's used that are used in it, but there are some pretty great melodic moments on this album, and it's a pretty pleasurable listen throughout, but it's just a bit less interesting than the previous releases, so I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Probably my least favorite in Tim Hecker's discography is An Imaginary Country, and this album isn't bad by any means. It's just a little bit boring, light, just very kind of airy, and there's not much going on. There's very minimal experimentation, and most of it is just kind of ambient synths. There's not too much noise, there's not too much just sound effects and stuff. There are those things here and there, but overall the main thing with this album is just these kind of higher pitched droning synths. Although I will say there is some pretty intense moments on this album here and there, with just a lot of different tracks playing sounds at the same time to create this kind of like heavenly sounding, sort of cacophonous kind of soundscape thing that is pretty cool. So occasionally there are some pretty intense and pretty beautiful moments on this one, but overall it's just a lot less interesting than any of his previous releases, and again, it doesn't really do anything new, and it's just a little bit boring throughout most of it. I'm going to go with a 6 out of 10 for this one. Next up is Ravedeath, 1972. This album takes a much heavier, more distorted, and just more intense approach to Tim Hecker's ambient style. It also features some more kind of light piano instrumentation, as well as some like I think pipe organ sounds that are digitally processed and just blended in with the synths. So that's a pretty cool effect. And this album overall just sort of paints the picture of a kind of apocalyptic, pretty deserted world that's kind of beautiful at times, kind of intense at other times, kind of sad at other times. This album's pretty good, and it's probably, while it's not like super interesting throughout most of it, it's probably the best example of the type of work we've seen so far, with just, you know, experimental ambient with a little bit of noise and sound effects here and there. So yeah, this album's pretty great. I can give it an 8 out of 10. Next is a sort of side project album that not too many people usually talk about, but it's called Dropped Pianos, and as the title may suggest, it's basically just a piano-based album. The only real significant sounds throughout most of this is piano and just like ambient synths. And it is kind of cool how if the ambient synths feel like they're created from like the trail off of the piano notes. So they just really blend together really well, and it feels like one very fluid, continuous thing, and all the tracks feel like they really belong on this album. And there are some occasional moments where you get some other sounds, some noisy, distorted stuff here and there, but not too much. Overall, there's really like 2 or even 1 at times main sounds that you're hearing throughout this album, so it makes it a little bit uninteresting. And even the melodies aren't super special. They're just kind of generic piano melodies. They're not really catchy or anything. They don't really stick out super well. So yeah, it's somewhat uninteresting, but for what it is, it's pretty good. I'd give it a 6 out of 10. Next we have Instrumental Tourist, another sort of side album, and actually a collaboration with Daniel Lopatin, hope I'm pronouncing that right, who is also better known as Oneotrix Point Never, who is another experimental electronic music producer who is pretty cool. This album is super interesting. There's a lot of variation, a lot of different sounds, a lot of different instruments, and a lot of progression, just a lot going on in this album. But at the same time, there's almost too much going on, and a lot of times it feels very randomized and disjointed and sort of purposeless, I guess. Like they're all just kind of doing this improvisationally on the fly without any sense of direction or anything. And there are also some obnoxious, very noisy, kind of ear-scraping parts of this album that just really stand out in a bad way. And they don't really work very well, like a lot of the noise on Mirages, for example. I think the noise worked really well with the rest of the synth work and instrumentation on that album. But here, there's a lot of places where the noise just feels very intrusive and unnecessarily abrasive and just kind of annoying. But I mean, this album has some very super creative instrumentation, and it really does keep you engaged throughout the whole thing. And it is pretty memorable for the most part, so I think I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. And then we have Virgins. This is the masterpiece album that all of this led up to. This album showcases the best of every single type of musical style that Tim Hecker has worked with, and yet, even though there's all these separate musical styles present here, it all feels very cohesive. It all fits together really well on this album. Nothing sticks out in a bad way, really. Percussive, minimalist piano melodies contribute to a lot of blissful and beautiful and emotional tracks on here. And they also link the album together really well, because some sort of similar piano melody will appear on a later track that you'll recognize from an earlier one, and you'll just see how it all connects. Some noisy and bassy stabs of sound will just come in sometimes and just really add to the intensity and the visceral, disorienting madness of some of the tracks on here, while at the same time some flutes and soft synths will come in at other times and just provide a nice, calming, relaxing breath of fresh air and just work very well as just simple ambient tracks. And as I said, everything just fits together super well here. There's the way it's placed out, like the calm tracks coming after the very intense, heavy, noisy ones. It just somehow works perfectly all together. And I mean, if I had to say anything bad about this album, it would basically be that, I mean, some parts sort of drone on for a little bit long without too much progression, but not really. They still usually progress pretty fast and change pretty quickly, and anything that does last for a while will usually be very interesting, and you'll want it to last. And also sometimes some noisy, bassy stabs will come out of nowhere and just kind of throw you off maybe a little bit, be a little bit disorienting, and some people might not like that, but again, I think it just adds the intensity really well and just provides for a huge range of feelings on this album. Virgins is truly a masterpiece, in my opinion. Maybe not the best album ever, but very close to it. I'm gonna go with a 9.5 out of 10. So yeah, that was the entire Tim Hecker discography review, excluding Love Streams, of course, which, as I mentioned, I will be covering in my next video with more detailed depth and just talking about it a lot more than the albums I talked about here. So subscribe to stay notified for when that'll come out if you aren't already. And hope you guys enjoyed watching. Hope you guys, if you didn't know about Tim Hecker before, maybe you'll like him now. I would heavily encourage you to listen to some of his albums, especially Virgins. And for those of you who are fans of Tim Hecker, if anybody's out there, I hope I did a decent job at reviewing his albums, and hopefully you agreed with most of what I said here. But yeah, thanks again for watching. See ya.